Now, as we know, the achievement of low inflation is one of the major economic goals by the government. And so now we're going to look at, in this video, how budgetary policy can help achieve this goal of low inflation. So to remind ourselves what low inflation is, so low inflation is achieved when the rate of inflation is around 2 to 3% CPI. So the CPI, Consumer Price Index, increases by around 2 to 3% per annum on average over the cycle, and the cycle being the business cycle. So we're going to see how budgetary policy can indeed achieve this economic goal. So this is all part of the federal government's goal of domestic economic stability. So this relates to 3 goals: 1, low inflation; 2, a strong and sustainable rate of economic growth; and 3, the goal for employment. So we're going to see how budgetary policy, in this case, in this lecture, can affect low inflation. So let's assume for the minute that the economy has not achieved the goal of low inflation, and so high inflation is occurring. And we're going to see the reasons behind high inflation. And as we can see, using demand-supply analysis, as we know, supply has an upward sloping, or aggregate supply has an upward sloping graph, and this is mapped against GDP, or income, and again, pi being the inflation level. So in many cases when there is high inflation, the aggregate demand curve has shifted upwards or to the right. So what this means is that instead of being at a domestically stable level of around pi star, due to capacity constraints, the inflation has increased to pi 1. And so we can see that demand pull inflation has caused the government to achieve its goal of low inflation. So currently we're at this point here, AD dash, where inflation is high. So let's say this is around 6% as opposed to around 3% being pi dash or pi star. So what are the precautionary measures the government could take in order to slow down aggregate demand? So we want to slow down aggregate demand, so it shifts back to this point here, or this line, or this curve there. So as we know, aggregate demand is a component of C plus I plus G plus X minus M, which could be written as net exports. So budgetary policy affects domestic production or expenditure directly. And so we can ignore net exports because it is not affected by domestic or the federal government. So this is exogenously determined. So we're going to assume that exports are determined by the demand of overseas sector, and imports we can assume, again, although it is determined by domestic confidence, we can assume that external stability is out of the control of the government, or relatively out of control of the government. So just for simplicity, we're going to assume that this doesn't actually exist. So we're going to look at aggregate demand as a component of C plus I plus G, and net exports we're going to assume that is not affected by budgetary policy for the minute. Okay, so we know that government budgetary policy, when there is an economic upswing, when aggregate demand is excessively high, that they're going to adopt contractionary policy. Contractionary and adopt a contractionary stance. And what this means is that they're going to decrease government expenditure. Firstly, by using automatic measures or automatic stabilizers, and secondly, using discretionary stabilizers. Okay, so we're going to look at how automatic stabilizers can affect aggregate demand, the aggregate demand equation. So automatic stabilizers relate to tax and welfare. And when there is high aggregate demand, this automatically means, as we can see, income is relatively high compared to the steady rate of growth or a sustainable rate of growth. So we have very high income, and what this means is that taxes increase. And again, because of people having jobs and people having high incomes, this means that welfare payments paid out to those unemployed would decrease. And automatically this means that government spending would decrease. Secondly, we can see that if these automatic stabilizers here are insufficient to slow aggregate demand back down to this point, or this curve there, the government could adopt various discretionary measures to slow down aggregate demand. And this could mean increasing the tax rate. This could mean slowing expenditure on various activities that the government has, or it could mean that the government could indeed move towards a budget surplus. And so again, because of this, government expenditure has decreased. So we can see that taxation affects both consumption expenditure and government expenditure. Government expenditure in that the government has high levels of surplus or revenue through taxation, and consumption expenditure in that we have lower disposable incomes available to us. And so when consumption expenditure decreases, we will see that aggregate demand as a result will also fall. And as the government adopts a contractionary stance, we can see that the government expenditure, both G1 and G2, would slow, and therefore again that would decrease aggregate demand as government expenditure decreases. And as a result, what would happen is that there will be an easing in demand inflation. And because budgetary policy works in a counter-cyclical way, this would then push aggregate demand back and move this high inflation rate of 6% back to the 3%, which is within the target range of 2 to 3% CPI per annum. And so that's how budgetary policy, through taxation and welfare and discretionary stabilizers, can help achieve the goal of low inflation.